All right, let's dive in, shall we? We're going deep today into the Senate confirmation hearings for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., President Trump's pick for Health and Human Services Secretary. And it's been, well, let's just say eventful. We're working from an article called Five Key Takeaways from Kennedy's Combative Second Hearing. And honestly, just from reading it, I'm not sure Kennedy's chances of getting confirmed are looking so good.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how his personal views, especially when it comes to vaccines, are kind of butting heads with what a lot of people see as like essential for this job. The hearings have become this battleground, not just for Kennedy's qualifications, but for the future of public health policy in America.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's on the edge of their seat,
Yeah.
waiting to see if he'll bend on these long-held beliefs or if this job will force him to. One of the first big clashes was with Senator Cassidy. He's a physician himself. And he shared this incredibly powerful story about a patient he lost to a totally preventable disease. You could just feel the weight of that story and how it had fueled his concerns about Kennedy's stance on vaccines.
Cassidy's story really drives home the point that personal experience shapes policy decisions. It was moving, for sure, but it also raises this tough question. How do you balance deeply held beliefs with scientific consensus? Especially when you're talking about someone who could be leading a major health agency.
Right, and then things ramped up even more. When Cassidy brought out a meta-analysis that completely debunks the link between vaccines and autism, but Kennedy pushed back, insisting he could find research to support his view. Seriously, you could hear a pin drop in that room.
It was such a classic example of scientific evidence versus individual interpretation, and it really gets at the heart of the worries people have about Kennedy's nomination. It's not just about having an opinion, it's about whether those opinions line up with what we know from science, especially when you're talking about the person who might be setting national health policy.
And Cassidy didn't hold back. He flat out told Kennedy that he was struggling with his nomination, questioning whether he could really lead on this issue given his beliefs. You could cut the tension with a knife.
Yeah.
But it also made me think about this bigger issue of public trust in science.
Exactly. When a high-profile figure like Kennedy challenges widely accepted scientific views, it can undermine public confidence in things like vaccines and other important health measures. It's a ripple effect, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, no kidding. But that was just round one, right? Things got even more heated with Senator Sanders. This time it was about lowering prescription drug costs, which, let's be honest, is a huge concern for pretty much everyone these days. It felt like watching two completely different healthcare philosophies go head-to-head.
Right. You have Sanders, who's been pushing for a more socialized healthcare system, and then Kennedy, who's more likely to favor market-driven solutions. It's a debate that's been going on forever, and this hearing just threw gasoline on the fire.
Oh yeah, it totally did. Kennedy actually accused Sanders of being a major recipient of pharmaceutical industry donations. You could practically see the steam coming out of Sanders' ears. He denied it instantly. And then things got really interesting.
It's interesting how they both tried to use campaign finance to discredit the other. It's classic politics, but it often sidesteps the actual policy issues. In this case, it makes you wonder, do campaign contributions really influence a politician's views on healthcare? And how much do those contributions actually matter in the grand scheme of things?
So Sanders said he'd received like $115,000 from individuals in the pharmaceutical industry. But Kennedy threw out a number closer to $1.5 million.
Yeah.
Then Sanders just drops this line, yeah, out of $200 million. I mean, talk about shade. It was hilarious, but also a pretty savvy way to deflect criticism.
Oh, it was brilliant. He managed to connect with his base, reinforce his image as a champion of the people, and totally undercut Kennedy's attack all at once.
Yeah, he did. But it wasn't all political games and witty comebacks. Senator Hassan's testimony brought a whole other level of intensity to the hearings. She got really personal, talking about her son, who has severe cerebral palsy. She was clearly frustrated hearing Kennedy repeat these debunked claims about vaccines and autism.
This is where the real-world impact of these policies hits you. Hassan's story reminds us that we're not just debating ideas. These are decisions that have real consequences for families struggling with very real challenges.
Right, and she called Kennedy out for rehashing settled science, saying it actually hinders progress in understanding and treating autism. She even said, and I'm quoting her here, "Please do not suggest that anybody in this body of either political party doesn't want to know what the cause of autism is." You could feel the emotion behind those words.
It was such a smart way to reframe the argument. Instead of getting stuck in the details of Kennedy's claims, she shifted the focus to the shared goal of helping families affected by autism. It was a powerful appeal to common ground, and it really highlighted the urgency of moving past this back and forth about vaccines.
I think what struck me most was how her words resonated with the anxieties of parents of children with autism. They want answers, they want support, and they deserve better than these outdated and disproven theories being given a platform.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that policy debates aren't just academic exercises. They have real-world consequences for vulnerable people.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We need to talk about abortion, which, as you know, is always a hot-button issue. And this is where things get a little tricky with Kennedy. Historically, he's been pro-choice, but now it seems like he's aligning himself more with Trump's stance, calling every abortion a tragedy.
It really highlights the tough position nominees are often in, trying to balance their own views with the expectations of the administration they're joining. Kennedy's shifting stance on abortion raises all sorts of questions about his personal convictions and whether political strategies at play here.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what's behind this change. Is it a genuine shift in his thinking or a calculated move? Either way, things got particularly tense during an exchange with Senator Blunt Rochester about emergency abortion access. Specifically, within the framework of the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTLA for short. This is a federal law that requires hospitals to provide emergency medical care, regardless of whether the patient can pay.
Right, and it becomes really important when a pregnant woman's life is in danger. It basically says that hospitals can't refuse to provide life-saving treatment, including abortion in emergency situations.
Exactly. So Blunt Rochester really pressed Kennedy on his personal beliefs about whether abortion should be allowed in emergencies to save a woman's life. And at first, Kennedy seemed hesitant to answer directly, which, never looks good in these situations.
It's a key point because it goes to the core of the abortion debate. While a lot of people have strong opinions about abortion in general, there's often more nuanced discussion about specific cases, like when the mother's life is at risk. Kennedy's initial hesitation suggested he was trying to avoid taking a firm stance on a very sensitive issue.
And that makes sense to a degree. It's a politically charged issue, and any clear answer could alienate some potential supporters. But he did eventually concede that abortion should be allowed if it's necessary to save the woman's life. So there's that.
That concession was important, even if it felt a bit forced. It suggests that even with something as divisive as abortion, there might be some common ground.
It's a glimmer of hope, right?
Yeah.
That even in the middle of these heated debates, there's still room for agreement. But, and this is a big but, it also makes you wonder how Kennedy would balance his personal views with the legal and ethical obligations of being HHS Secretary.
Yeah. Exactly. It's one thing to say what you believe. It's another to uphold law, even when it goes against your own moral compass. That's a question that will keep coming up as this nomination moves forward.
Okay, now for what might be the most concerning part of this whole hearing, the doubts about Kennedy's understanding of basic federal health policies, specifically Medicare. And I'm not talking about a little slip-up. It seemed like he genuinely lacked knowledge about the programs he'd be overseeing.
This was potentially the most damaging part of the hearing, because it makes you question whether Kennedy is actually competent to lead such a big agency. It goes beyond just political differences and raises concerns about his ability to actually manage these complex healthcare systems that affect millions of Americans.
Yeah, like he actually mixed up Medicare and Medicaid, which are two completely different programs with different eligibility criteria, funding, and benefits. I mean, these are pretty basic distinctions in healthcare policy. And then he got basic details wrong about what Medicare Parts A, B, and C even cover. It was kind of hard to watch.
And it wasn't just embarrassing. It fed into this idea that Kennedy's not prepared for this job, that he doesn't have the basic knowledge needed to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. And that perception can be really hard to shake.
And Senator Hassan definitely called him out on it. She was very direct in her questioning, saying to Kennedy, "You want us to confirm you to be in charge of Medicare, but it seems like you don't even know the basics of how it works." Mic drop.
That pretty much sums up the main worry here. Does Kennedy have the skills and knowledge to actually lead HHS? Big question that's hanging over everything.
Yeah, it is. Well, that was part one of our deep dive into the wild ride that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation hearings. And believe me, this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll dig deeper into the implications of all of this and explore what Kennedy's potential leadership could mean for the future of healthcare in America. Welcome back to the deep dive. I don't know about you, but my head is still spinning from that first part of the Kennedy hearings. It's like every issue we're facing right now as a nation, Science versus personal belief, the cost of medication, even abortion. It's all tangled up in this one nomination. Where do we even go from here?
Yeah, you've really hit on something there. These hearings, they're like a mirror, reflecting all of our societal divisions. And what makes it even more complicated is this growing distrust of institutions and experts that we see, which Kennedy really seems to tap into.
That's what's so fascinating to me. And honestly, a little unsettling. It's like we're in this time where going against the grain is celebrated, even if the challenge is based on, not the strongest foundation.
Yeah.
Do you think that's part of Kennedy's appeal, even with all these inconsistencies we've seen?
It's definitely part of it. You've got a segment of the population that feels ignored, overlooked by these institutions they see as out of touch. So when someone like Kennedy comes along and voices those frustrations, even if it contradicts the science, it resonates with them.
That makes sense. But where does that leave us in terms of making good policy decisions? If we can't even agree on the facts, how can we move forward on something as complex as healthcare? Like we were talking about Medicare and his apparent lack of knowledge there. How can you be in charge of something so massive if you don't get the basics?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. You need someone who's ready to go on day one, who can navigate all the ins and outs of these programs, not someone who needs to be taught Medicare 101. And it makes you wonder, how much weight does loyalty carry compared to actual experience when it comes to these appointments?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
And speaking of expertise, let's go back to the vaccine issue for a sec. This time, it wasn't just about autism. It was about these broader claims he made about vaccine safety. And from what I saw, even some Republicans on the committee weren't comfortable with what he was saying.
Yeah, that was a big moment because it shows that this worry about vaccine misinformation, it's going beyond the usual party lines. We've seen vaccine hesitancy linked with certain groups and political leanings. But when you have Republicans expressing concern, it suggests they're realizing this is a public health threat, regardless of your political stance.
It's like a wake-up call, almost.
Yeah.
It's not a fringe issue anymore.
Yeah.
So do you think this whole debate is driving us further apart? Or could this actually be a chance for some, productive conversation?
There's always a risk that we get more divided, especially with how the media works these days, where extreme views get all the attention. But I do see potential for a more nuanced conversation, one that recognizes the concerns of people who are hesitant about vaccines while still making it clear what the science says.
It's about finding that balance between individual choice and protecting the community, which is tough.
It is, but these hearings have definitely put that conversation front and center. Now, whether it leads to real change or just digs us deeper into our positions, well, that's the question.
Right. But beyond the specific policy debates, I feel like there's a bigger theme here, and that's this erosion of trust in institutions and experts.
Absolutely. It's like people are questioning everything. And it makes it nearly impossible to have a real conversation, especially about something as complex as healthcare.
Right. And that makes it easy for politicians to exploit the situation.
Offering simple answers to complicated problems, even if those answers are based on bad logic or misinformation. And this brings us back to Kennedy. His skepticism of scientific consensus and his lack of understanding of basic government programs. They just feed into this distrust.
It's like a vicious cycle. The less we trust institutions, the more we buy into these alternative narratives.
Exactly, which then makes us trust institutions even less.
So how do we break out of this? If we can't agree on basic facts or trust the systems in place, where do we go from here?
That's the challenge we face. And honestly, it's why platforms like this one, this podcast, are so important. We need places for open, honest dialogue where we can explore different viewpoints, challenge our own assumptions, and really grapple with these complexities.
I love that. We need more spaces where people can actually listen to each other, even when they disagree, and be open to the idea that they might be wrong. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that these problems need solutions we work on together.
Exactly. We need to move away from this us versus them thinking and start focusing on what's best for everyone. It starts with a shared commitment to truth, to evidence, and a willingness to have these tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable.
Well said.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a lot, but I have a feeling there's more to this story. What are some things you'll be watching for as this nomination process goes on? What should our listeners keep an eye on?
I'll be looking at how senators, especially Republicans, respond to these concerns. Will they stick with their party, or will they demand more from Kennedy? And of course, public opinion matters. Will there be a backlash against Kennedy's nomination? And if so, how will that affect the final decision?
All good points. And for our listeners, stay informed. Read more than just the headlines and talk about this with your friends and family. We can't just sit back and watch this happen.
You're right. And remember, this is just one piece of a much bigger picture. These debates about healthcare, vaccines, the government's role, these conversations are going to keep happening long after these hearings are over. So stay engaged, stay informed, and stay curious.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive into the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. confirmation hearings. We'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll explore even more of what this all means for the future of healthcare in America. Until then, keep those brains working. All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. confirmation hearings. We've broken down the clashes, the controversy, the concerns, but now it's time to zoom out a bit. What does all of this mean? What are the bigger implications of this whole thing, especially for the future of healthcare in America?
This whole thing, it's really like looking at American society under a microscope. You see the cracks, the distrust, the deep divisions, and healthcare, as we've been talking about, is right at the center of it all.
It feels like healthcare has become this battleground for so many bigger issues. Individual rights versus collective responsibility, the government's role, even the nature of truth and expertise. It's a lot to process.
It is, and I think that's part of what makes this story so fascinating, and honestly a little scary. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable realities about where we are as a country.
So let's imagine for a second that Kennedy actually gets confirmed. What kind of impact could he have on the Department of Health and Human Services?
Yeah.
And ultimately on the health of millions of Americans?
Well, based on what he's said and done in the past, it's likely he'd focus on individual choice and try to limit how much the government is involved in healthcare. That could mean policies that weaken vaccine requirements, cut funding for public health programs, and maybe even make it harder to access certain reproductive health services.
You mentioned the scientific community earlier. How do you think they'd react to having someone like Kennedy with his views leading HHS? There's already a lot of tension there, it seems like.
Oh, there would definitely be pushback, a lot of it. Scientists and doctors, they base their work on evidence and research. And Kennedy's track record of promoting misinformation, especially about vaccines, would really damage that trust. It could create a very difficult environment for working together and making policies based on evidence.
It also sounds like setting the stage for constant conflict, with ideology clashing with science at every turn.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not a good situation, especially when we're talking about something as important as public health.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say Kennedy doesn't get confirmed. Does this whole thing just go away, or has it already had an impact?
I don't think it just disappears. These hearings have exposed these deep divisions in our society, and they're not going anywhere. We're dealing with fundamental questions about trust, authority, the role of government, and those questions are going to keep shaping our politics for a long time.
It's like we've opened this Pandora's box, and all these complex issues have come pouring out. So it feels like this is bigger than just one person's nomination. This feels like a real turning point in how we approach healthcare and maybe even governing in general.
I agree. It feels like a reckoning. We can't just ignore these problems. We have to find a way to bridge these gaps, to rebuild trust, and to have these tough conversations.
We've talked a lot about the challenges here, but are there any reasons to be hopeful? What can our listeners do to stay informed, engaged, and maybe even make a difference?
The fact that we're having this conversation at all, that people are paying attention, that's a good sign. It means people care. My advice is to stay curious, stay critical, and stay connected. Find reliable information, challenge your own assumptions, and most importantly, talk to each other. Have respectful conversations with people who see things differently than you do.
I love that. Stay curious, stay critical, stay connected. That's great advice. And remember, even though these issues feel huge, each of us can play a part in shaping the future.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and watch. This is our responsibility, and we have to step up.
Well said. Well, expert speaker, thank you so much for your insights and expertise today. This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most complex and important stories of our time. We hope you've learned something, challenged your thinking, and maybe even found a bit of hope along the way. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.